So thanks for that insightful presentation, Andreas. Today and the rest of the conference, we're going to discuss the role that hydrogen can play in reducing Houston's carbon footprint and maintaining Houston's leadership role as energy capital while expanding into new markets. So we have three panels focusing on, first, what can Houston bring to the table in terms of creating a hydrogen economy? Second, how the future might unfold in terms of hydrogen production. And then finally, a discussion on what might be the killer app that drives new hydrogen demand. We've asked some of the leading experts from across the country to join us for this discussion. You can feel free to join the discussion by putting your questions in the chat feature on the right side of the Whova platform on your PC, and we'll add your thoughts to the conversation. Following the panels, we'll hear from U.S. Rep. Lizzie Fletcher, who's been a staunch advocate in Washington for Houston's energy issues, and from Jigar Shah, a former venture capitalist and energy visionary, now running the Department of Energy's loan program. Finally, we reserve time at the end of the conference for networking, and we'll have 2 breakout sessions where we can talk about what we've learned. I hope you'll stick around for the opportunity to meet your colleagues and share what you've learned. We're hopeful that this conference will help us build a support for a new low-carbon vision that we're calling H2 Houston Hub that shows how Houston might become a leading global hydrogen cluster and for production and applications. To create that vision, our panels will take a strategic planning process called Future Back to define a future state of the world and to develop a common vision for Houston. We're asking our experts on each panel to help us develop a vision for Houston's energy future and the role that hydrogen might play. We'll then work backward to develop a set of cross-cutting activities such as policy, economic development, and workforce initiatives so we can collectively activate this future. As I mentioned, we'll begin our discussion with a broad focus on what it will take to launch Houston's Hydrogen Hub. To get us started, I'd like to introduce our first panel. Their complete bios can be found on the conference platform or at the houston.org website /energy conference. Our panelists are Chris Angelides, head of U.S. Energy Transition Strategy for Shell. Rich Byrnes, Chief Infrastructure Officer of the Port Houston. Scott Doyle, Vice President, Natural Gas, CenterPoint Energy. Pierre-Etienne Franc, Co-founder and Chief Executive Officer, 5T Hydrogen. And Vaseem Khan, Vice President, Global Vice President, Operations, Performance, and Digital for McDermott. Our moderator is Andy Steinhubl, a former KPMG and McKinsey Managing Director, who's now Vice Chair of the Center for Houston's Future. Andy, welcome.
Brett, thanks a lot and really appreciate the lead-in. It's been very exciting to be part of the conference the last couple of days, and the notion of tipping point really resonated with me. And coincidentally, when the panelists huddled in preparation for this event, our sense was that rather than spend time on making the case for hydrogen in Houston and broadly what a vision for hydrogen in Houston might look like, that we might start with a straw man, have some panelists react to that, and then spend most of our time talking about how to make it happen. And the passion in this panel is very much along the lines of this should happen, and we can work together to accelerate making it happen. So with that in mind, I'd like to go through some of the center prior work on a vision for hydrogen in Houston. And then, as I say, I'll ask a couple panelists to react to that, and then we'll have each panelist talk about their vantage point and what they would envision doing to help accelerate towards that vision. So if you'd be so kind, just please move to the next slide. Andreas established some scenarios in his keynote here a moment ago, and I'd just like to highlight a couple of principles there, and then I'll go deeper and use this discussion to draw out the implications for Houston. But effectively, what he said is, if you look at today, 100% effectively of hydrogen is made through fossil fuels, typically natural gas, splitting methane. That's the gray wedge shown on the far left. That's about 100 million metric ton global market, 10 million in the US. And various projections, if you look at the upper right, the starburst would suggest we need roughly 7 to 10 times the amount of hydrogen that's being produced today to get at the so-called hard to abate areas of the industry and economy, heavy transportation, process heat, long duration storage, et cetera. The shape of how, the pace of how we get from here to there are the questions, and hence his variety of scenarios. Those scenarios, of course, will look different at a global level, or could play out differently at a global level. They will also play out, we believe, very differently at a regional level, and Houston will likewise have its own unique path from left to right. And what will drive that path, we're highlighting some of the key factors in the upper right. So do policies and incentives or taxes exist that would favor the pace or one technology versus another? And what assets does a local area or region have in place? So in the case of blue, is there an existing hydrogen system? Of course, has been highlighted in prior prior speakers. There are a lot of assets that Houston has relevant to hydrogen. We'll touch on those in a minute. We also have assets relevant to green hydrogen and the existence of wind and solar power, where we're a leader. So not every region has those things. So depending on the assets in the region, the incentives and policies in the region, hence goes the path. So just wanted to highlight some of the factors, because we'll come back to those and the implications for Houston. So if we could go to the next slide. Just as an illustration of how one local area put their local resources together with a plan, I'd like to just highlight an analog, the Port of Rotterdam, which is following a gray to blue to green path unique to their position. So in the upper left, it's showing a project called Porthos, which is nearing a financial investment decision. It would be their CO2 storage mechanism. It would pull carbon dioxide off of their onshore industry, which is shown on the middle left-hand portion of the diagram. They have a refining system. Rotterdam is known as a global refining center, akin to Houston, akin to Singapore. So they would be capturing the carbon dioxide off of their blue hydrogen production. They're also nearing a financial investment decision on a green hydrogen electrolyzer park that's shown in the lower left. And both forms of hydrogen are feeding into a pipeline network that will support not only the port area, but move from left to right into the greater Netherlands country and then onward into Europe. And their overall ambition is to pivot from being a global fossil commodity hub to being a regional hydrogen hub, complete with trading as well as the logistics, as well as the opportunity to import that ship up there in the upper left. So they're heading towards being a hydrogen hub, and they're well down the road with the policies, incentives, and projects, and nearing funding on those projects to make that happen. So keep that analog in mind, because it's a lookalike to varying degrees to Houston. If we move to the next page, please. Thank you. So Bobby Tudor mentioned a number of these facts yesterday, I think, the day before. That might help to visualize it a bit, though. Houston has a premier existing gray hydrogen system. So the 48 plants that Bobby referred to span from roughly Corpus Christi down in the southeast over to Beaumont in eastern Texas. The 900 miles of pipelines he mentioned run across that system. It may be hard to see on the diagram, but also spotted in there are salt cavern storage facilities dedicated to hydrogen. The Houston area is unique in having that geologic feature and having its proximate to boot alongside that system or within that system for hydrogen inventorying purposes. And of course, all this overlays a proximity to the potential for CCUS, because there are a lot of depleted and active oil and gas reservoirs in that area. There's also a bit of an infrastructure system called the Denbury in the Beaumont area. And then, of course, it sits on the port, and we are the leading global commodity export port. So in a case where we go long hydrogen to feed markets that are short, Houston's well positioned to play an export role. We saw already Rotterdam's planning for imports, Germany's planning for imports, Japan's planning, many countries around the world will be short. Houston has the potential to be long, leveraging this premier system. If we could move to the next page, please. In addition to the existing gray system, I mentioned at the outset that Texas also is blessed with significant green or resources relevant to green. So Texas is the #1 wind state. We're the #2 solar state next to California. What that means is there's a lot of off-peak power, which is what the chart on the left is showing. We have a significant percent of our power is at a wholesale level less than 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is very inexpensive. That's important because 60 to 70% of the cost currently of electrolysis, which is the other path to hydrogen, splitting water, requires electricity. So that access to low-cost power is a significant leg up to stimulate green hydrogen chains. On the right-hand side, another interesting feature of the Houston power market is we have very high summer-winter differentials. And if you couple that with the salt cavern storage capacities I mentioned, which could also be expanded, it creates the opportunity to bank hydrogen, make hydrogen during low-cost parts of the year, typically the winter, and then take it out of storage, run it through a fuel cell or burn it in a gas fire generation plant in the summer. Very few places in the world have low-cost storage that would afford this type of seasonal long-duration storage. So we've got some unique hands to play relative to green chains. It's just those chains are far less mature technology-wise and capacity-wise. We make very little globally as well as Houston, but we have good assets to play into that. So moving to the last page, which is an integration of all of the above, and this is a one-page representation. Appreciate it's got a lot on it, but let me just quickly run through it. So the same gray hydrogen system plants or representation run along the Gulf Coast in this depiction. But what's added as well is green hydrogen inputs down there in the lower left, Corpus Christi area, where there's a lot of wind generation and wind generation planned. The north west corner as well, the Panhandle area is a big source of solar and wind power. So those red dotted lines, they're all feeding hydrogen in. And think of the salt caverns down there. There's a big one shown on the lower right that's kind of an inventory, taking all this hydrogen in, and then it's going out to various markets. So you see the highways kind of boldly outlined. Well, those highways have pipelines and pipeline rights-of-way paralleling that. So we could transport hydrogen out of a Houston hub, perhaps to California, take advantage of their low carbon fuel standard. We could push it up towards Dallas, which is a high density trucking corridor. Along the way, we've got our airport, Bush Airport, that is a candidate. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we could also put it on the water and hence the ships out there. We have room to expand our CCUS system, not just around the Gulf, but we can push it out to the Permian. And of course, the Permian can send us back in low-cost natural gas. So we can not only take advantage of our existing blue system, but we could also deploy state-of-the-art blue with even higher CO2 capturability rates to expand that system. So our potential to be a hub, to not only drive hydrogen penetration in the greater Houston area, but to drive it potentially further across the US and even be a global player is definitely within our grasp. So I'll leave it there in terms of the Cook's tour of possibilities in greater Houston and beyond. And now I'd like to ask a couple of our panelists, Chris and Pierre, to comment. And first, turning to Chris. Chris, as Brett mentioned, from Shell. And Shell, of course, has been a leader for many, many years in studying hydrogen opportunities, and more recently has been a catalyst for projects throughout the globe. And so, Chris, I'm interested in your take on that Cook's tour and how Shell would see it.
Thank you, Andy. And good morning to all in the US time zones, and I guess good afternoon if you're elsewhere. I should also say congrats to the Greater Houston Partnership and the Center for Houston Future for this great event, and of course, thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. So yes, what you showed resonates well with me. Shell is indeed participating in a number of hydrogen projects to better understand supply and demand issues, and to demonstrate commerciality for hydrogen as a fuel, especially in the heavy-duty transport sector. We're a part of several initiatives aimed at encouraging the adoption of hydrogen in transport, from a hydrogen refueling network for passenger cars in California, to the so-called H2 Accelerate Consortium that aims to enable conditions for mass market rollout for hydrogen trucks in Europe. You mentioned the port of Rotterdam. So in that example, again, Shell is a key partner in what is called H-Vision, which is a consortium of about 10 companies looking to decarbonize industry by replacing refinery fuel gases and coal with blue hydrogen. So hydrogen can indeed transform the energy industry, especially sectors like heavy-duty transport. But the reality is production costs remain high, and the demand side is still somewhat unclear, which we think hampers investment and the ability for the sector to scale. So, you know, looking at everything you presented, I think key is demonstrating the commercial markets, and that's what can help Houston accelerate.
Mm-hmm. So stimulate the demand to warrant an expansion of the supply.
That's right.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Chris. Pierre, any other comments, Chris, or you're
Nope.
good?
Thank you.
Thank you. Pierre, you've had experience going back to some of the original Hydrogen Council thinking on the role of hydrogen in these various hard-to-abate areas, and have a long history of involvement in various hydrogen capacities. I appreciate your take on the vision straw man and other thoughts.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you. It's a very interesting topic because it's true that Houston is the hub of the oil and gas and the energy industry in the world. Just to comment on it, I would like just to put in perspective the figures, because if you take Rotterdam, as you said, Rotterdam production and demand for hydrogen today is 0.4 million tons. In the vision of Rotterdam as a hub by 2050, which is basically moving to blue and clean, the hydrogen production reaches 20 million tons, out of which only 7 million tons is done locally, and the rest is imported to be then re-exported to the German and Northwestern Europe needs. And for that, of course, they will do carbon capture and storage using the ongoing projects that Shell and a couple of other companies are involved in. But they will also they would need 200 gigawatts of electrolyzers, out of which they just don't have enough with the local offshore wind industry. So they will basically import hydrogen. One question will be, is it ammonia? Is it hydrogen in liquid form? Is it methanol? Whatever, hydrogen will have to be imported. So if you translate that to Houston, and you said there is a factor of 20, it's of course very dependent on the type of industry you have around Houston, but starting from 3 million tons of hydrogen, if you do the math, you're going to probably multiply by 10 or 20 the needs for hydrogen. And so that triggers a lot of questions, of course, because Houston is, like Rotterdam, in a very good position to choose whether you want to push blue or whether you want to push green, because you're blessed with all accesses. And that comes back to the macro view, which is which one is going the fastest and what's the right scenarios to worldwide bring hydrogen as a low carbon solution to scale. And you referred to the Hydrogen Council, and that's true that we did a couple of studies, narratives, trying to show the vision jointly with many players that are on the table, starting with Shell again, but also Air Liquide, Toyota, and many others. And we did not at the time, when we made the first study showing that hydrogen could move from 70 to 700 million tons in the next decades, we did not at the time move into that tricky discussion of what's the color. And we took assumptions that it would be solved later. But recently, we went back to the topic and we pushed forward, the Council pushed forward a life cycle assessment of all the pathways to do hydrogen and a life cycle assessment supply chain position that we did with McKinsey. And the outcome of it is that there is no silver bullet. You can have a full green scenario, but it's costing 3 trillion. It requires basically electricity generation capacity, which is equivalent to the current worldwide energy generation, electricity generation, sorry, which is not so big because the trend is to electrify more and more the source of your energy, but it's a significant move. You need to move the electrolyzer capacity to 600 gigawatts, so it's very big compared to 100 megawatts today, which is installed, or a little bit more than that, but not so much more. The blue scenario, which would be ideal for all the asset owners that have a lot of SMR and ATAs and don't want to have those assets become stranded assets, is also putting a lot of pressure on the CCS capacities, because today only 30 million tons roughly of CCS is up and running, 65 facilities, half of them in the US. It's still small compared to what needs to be done, but it's feasible. And so the Council, you were asking that, the Council took a halfway position saying that if you mix the specific geographic access to caverns, to low or cheap natural gas, or to cheap renewable energy, then you can blend the solution, and it's a mix of green and blue, and in the end, it's roughly 50-50. And the total cost then is a little bit lower. The emissions reduced are lower, but it's the best way forward, coupling reduction emissions and average competitiveness. So for Houston, I think this is indeed the right moment, but it's now, because the CCS route is challenged in many countries, maybe not in the US, but it's challenged in other countries. So it needs to be rapidly up and running to show that it's a solid way forward, because it's obvious it's a solid way forward, but it needs to be up and running with large projects. And green is, of course, a very strong solution. Texas is, I think, generating 36, the capacity is 36 gigawatts. It's more or less what you would need to convert the 3 million ton into hydrogen that you produce into green hydrogen. It's not relevant, but it's interesting in terms of orders of magnitude. So that's the real moment to move. I think that's for sure.
Well, I think you hit on many very interesting points, but let me bring it back to kind of, in my mind, one really critical question for Houston. Do you see the potential for I'll call it an outsized role for Houston in terms of blue hydrogen, particularly over the now through 2030, 2035 timeframe?
Well, I think if it does not happen in Houston, I don't know where it's going to happen, because it's trying to move in Europe, and Shell is pushing, Equinor is pushing, many players are pushing, but the regulators, the not in my backyard syndrome of many players is challenging it. So there is an interesting avenue to play for Houston to show the way there, because CCS is fundamental for Houston.
Mm-hmm. Great, very good, thank you. Okay, I'd like to now move to the next portion of the panel discussion, as I outlined at the outset. And the idea would be, we've got executives here from many different platforms, many different walks, intersect the hydrogen chain in different manners, different points, and would like each of you to just give a thumbnail of how your company participates in the chain, and to the extent you participate in the Houston area specifically, that would be helpful. And then just give us your thoughts on what it would take to make this vision for hydrogen in Houston happen. So I may turn back to Chris to kick it off, and then we'll go around with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. So, look, Shell wants to play its part in establishing hydrogen as a large-scale option for low carbon fuel. We are taking the lead by developing transport refueling networks elsewhere in this country and globally. We are working with partners to ensure that there is sufficient demand in place. And look, throughout this, you're going to hear me consistently talk about both the supply and the demand side. That will be critical to the success of any demonstration projects here for hydrogen in industry and in transport. So Shell sees a future where hydrogen fuel plays an important role, as well in transport, as well as acting as a carrier for heavy industries such as cement and steel and chemicals, etc. So we see opportunities across the hydrogen supply chain, including the production, the storage, the shipping, and of course, end customer solutions. So to ensure the development of this entire value chain, Shell wants to connect the multiple parts of the business. I mean, Pierre mentioned the renewables, mentioned electrolysis, the demand in our own refinery assets, certainly the development of carbon capture and storage, and eventually the fuels retail network. So, you know, you ask what role does our company want to play? We want to play a role across the entire value chain. So maybe I'll pause here, and then if you come back around, you know, we can talk about.
Yeah. Just one quick follow-on of all the markets that you highlight, and you've now hit a couple times the importance of the market end of the chain, as well as the production and the midstream. But the market side, where in the Houston context would you see the priority on market development?
I think road transport, heavy duty transport, certainly consideration of can you export clean hydrogen to other parts of the United States and eventually globally. Again, I go back to what was mentioned before. Other parts of the world will not be able to meet their goals. They will need hydrogen to come from elsewhere. So I think as long as Houston looks at the entire value chain and takes, of course, export into consideration, we can build a very strong commercial story.
Mm-hmm. And your sense is that's because we've got the infrastructure to do it, the incremental economics of those two pursuits, heavy transportation and export, are in our favor? Is that the?
Well, we have, look, we have all of the ingredients here. We have the supporting infrastructure. We have the pipelines for transportation. We have all of the carbon capture and storage technology know-how. We have the production facilities. We have all the pieces. What we need is coordination, especially in public and private organizations and investment streams, at a local, at a national, at an international level. But if you take all of these pieces together, Houston, I think, is uniquely placed for this.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Rich, yeah, it's interesting. I showed that Port of Rotterdam slide, or actually Rotterdam slide. It's often referred to as decarbonizing the port, which I find somewhat interesting in that it's really about using the port and the land and the port's proximity to the shipping and pipelines and industry that's really driving the decarbonization. So I'm interested in how you see it and how you see it in the context of the Port of Houston.
Right, Andy. And thanks for having me as part of this panel. I think coordination requires the different perspectives, and I'm glad to be here. So just let me put it in perspective. Houston is home to the country's largest port by tonnage. There's 20,000 ship transits per year visiting 200 public docks and private facilities that support the largest petrochemical complex. It's also home to 6,000 to 7,000 truck visits at our container terminals, which are the largest on the Gulf Coast. So if hydrogen and energy transition are going to happen anywhere, it's going to be Houston with a unique mix of skills, industry expertise, the installed infrastructure that's already here, the trading volumes, and the transportation intensity, as Chris mentioned. Houston has two unique advantages. One is what I just mentioned, that combination, and the other is the business environment. Ideas that make business sense are going to be economically resilient. And so the more free market nature of how things work in Houston means concepts are going to be stress tested, and they'll last longer because of that test. So what can Port Houston do? The point of the port is driving regional prosperity, and that means supporting a sustainable economy and an environment so Houston continue to lead as the energy and commerce capital. And so what we've done is undertake an initiative we call sustainability action teams, aimed at defining where the port can play and what port stakeholders value, and where the port can either lead or partner or maybe support from the side because it's really somebody else's initiative. And our stakeholders include all sectors of the industry, carriers, cargo shippers, and also our community and environmental advocates and so forth. And they've identified the number one issue for sustainability in Houston is clean energy. And that's followed closely by emissions reduction, the circular economy, and community strengthening. So that's led to a lot of discussions around specific opportunities to work with large energy players and entrepreneurs alike for projects that foster adoption of the hydrogen supply chain, alternative fuels, whether they be hydrogen, carbon neutral methanol, ammonia, batteries, and also carbon capture and other innovative technologies. In many cases, these, our role is to really connect the dots, and I like Chris's mention of coordination between public and private agencies, connect the dots between new technologies and the transportation demand in terms of ships and trucks, and in some case, partnering in specific ventures. We're connecting the dots globally as well by the launches, I was gonna say this month, but it's actually July now. In June, we launched the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition with Shell and Kirby and other companies, which is focused on decarbonization and shipping. And then the International Energy Agency's Global Hydrogen Ports Coalition to share knowledge across the port. The port is leading in areas it controls as well, sort of inside our fence line, including reducing our carbon footprint 55% over the last 4 years through an asset-backed energy contract, electricity contract. But we're also thinking in the future, such as our maritime education and our STEM education support, which is going to provide people with the entrepreneurial and technical skills to keep hydrogen and the transition going. If we think about 2050, I don't know if anybody on this panel is going to still be working, but we need the next generation to be skilled up and working. And then Greater Houston, can accelerate the transition by, again, working together. Over a century ago, Houston, that very port was created through a big idea called the Houston Plan to create the ship channel. And we're widening and deepening that ship channel again, and that's going to enable us to expand this export story that has been mentioned a couple of times. But the point was the community saw a transformative opportunity and rallied together to make it happen. And then once the common cause was set up, they got out of each other's way. And, this sort of free market economy we have in Houston has been a bastion of innovation. One final thought, which is, when we listen to our stakeholders, it's really about what can we do for them yesterday as much as what can we do in 2050. And so we have to balance sort of near-term impact projects that perhaps start technology adoption, start fuel cell driven trucks or other alternative fuels in ocean vessels, that can happen within the next 3 to 5 year time frame, as well as thinking about 2050.
That's great, Rich. Thanks. So it sounds like the Port of Houston is all in. You've got initiatives inside your fence, but if I'm hearing you right, you're all in also on being a catalyst for a number of things we're talking about outside the fence, just given where the port sits and your role as a connector across a number of these constituencies, or at least relationships with a number of these constituencies.
Yeah. Our engagement model is what can we lead, what can we partner on, and what can we support? And we don't want to get out of our lane. We are a port, but we are at the nexus of thousands, literally thousands of supply and value chains. And so connecting the dots is a really important role for the port.
Terrific. Very exciting. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Scott, and Scott leads the portion of CenterPoint that's involved in gas transportation, short and long haul. And transportation of hydrogen is if you will, a bit of a tricky thing because of the lack of density. And so say cost, it's reasonable cost to produce it. There are different end uses that have various economics, but moving it around is a bit of an art. And so, Scott, I'd like to better understand your company's vantage point and your perspectives on how to expand the hydrogen economy in Houston.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And I'll go back to maybe where Chris started with supply and demand, and think about it at least from the demand perspective. Just a quick, for those of you that are not Houston natives or unfamiliar with us, we do operate the largest natural gas distribution network in the United States, with well over 100,000 miles of pipeline facilities across 8 states, serving 4.7 million customers. And when we think about what goes through our system, as a company, we have to be thoughtful about our own customers' emissions. And we have to do that because for many of you who are maybe in the industrial segment, you report your own emissions. We have to report the emissions on behalf of our customers. So when we think about cleaning up our system or our operations, or moving towards a decarbonized future, we need to be mindful of our residential and commercial customer emissions, because we have the responsibility of reporting those. So just when we talk about scale, think of that for our own operations versus the emissions of our customers. It's a 50-to-1 ratio of the emissions of our customers versus what needs to be done to our systems. We need to be thinking about how to clean up the supply that's moving its way through our system. So one of the projects we're working on up in Minneapolis this year, we'll complete it later this year, is a green hydrogen production facility where we'll blend hydrogen into our gas supply stream, well below the thresholds that are known in the industry to be safe, which is below 20%. Will be well below 20%, well below 10% even as well. As we get experience with that, we're moving that same pilot to Houston. We have 4 locations in Houston where we currently blend propane air into our system during peaking events. Very natural site for us to locate a facility like that. But at the end of the day, we don't see ourselves as producers of hydrogen. We're really more on the demand side on behalf of our customers as we procure supply that greens up our supply and helps them with their emissions as well. So as we think about hydrogen long term, it is about the blending. It's also about the ability to take advantage of the networks that we have in place. We're good at building networks in dense urban environments, whether it's overhead electric lines or underground pipelines as well. When you think about the demand on our system, we transport roughly 800 BCF of natural gas across our network on an annualized basis. About half of that is transported for others. So if you think about blending at the 10% range, let's just use that, you're talking about anywhere from 40 to 80 billion cubic feet of natural gas that's being displaced if we're able to blend hydrogen into that particular stream as well. A couple of other things we're doing, we're participating in research activities outside of our company, collaborating with others, both with our organizations, the Gas Technology Institute and the Edison Electric Institute. There's work that's being done in conjunction with the national laboratories. There's also other work being done in the H2 at Scale projects, where we'll participate in a project here in Houston with the National Renewable Energy Labs that are part of the national labs as well. But we see this as a journey, and I'll leave with this, and this is, you heard a little bit from Pierre as well when we talk about scale. You know, there's good news and bad news with hydrogen. The good news is a lot of the technology is already proven. It's well known, so it's easy to apply and start using. The bad news is we haven't figured out the ultimate economics of it because of the density of the energy of hydrogen, the economics associated with that, but then also just the cost of producing it at scale in an economic way. That's ultimately what we're going to be looking for, is the ability for our customers, knowing that we're going to blend, but have it at a cost that's affordable as we make this transition as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Scott. So if I might paraphrase, you're getting your system ready in anticipation, to Chris's point, of that supply and supply expansion coming into place, and the market development on the other side. Although you bring existing customers to the table, but presumably you in the system could play a role in accessing new customers. I'd like to just ask you about one other thing. Pierre highlighted the importance of CCUS and Greater Houston leadership on the CCUS front. How would CenterPoint play into that from a transportation standpoint?
Sure. I think you think about what's in the art of the possible, and clearly these are not well-formed design ideas, but ultimately, is there a market for us to build a network from residential customers, and bring the carbon back to some sort of network that takes it somewhere else to be injected or to be taken care of in a different way as well. Since we do build networks and we build them well and can manage them, we certainly can bring a carbon capture network to the masses. And I think that's in the future, obviously, but it is a solution that can be considered if some other sort of carbon capture ring or hub is developed that can help in a number of ways in our business in particular.
Mm-hmm. So again, if the source materializes and the end use, if you will, you're looking for the anchors of that chain, and you're prepared to facilitate the midstream in between. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
That's great. Thank you very much. I might turn to Vaseem, and McDermott has done a host of projects. I'll put them under the banner of decarbonization across technologies and in many parts of the world. Very interested in how you see the greater Houston landscape and what you think we're missing and what we need to do to kind of make these types of projects happen here.
All right, so thank you, Andy, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm actually in The Hague today in one of our offices, and we're about 15 miles from the Rotterdam port, so we know, what Rotterdam is doing quite well. So we live, ladies and gentlemen, on the very practical end of the spectrum. So we are the people who are tasked to turn aspiration into reality. So McDermott has a 100-year-plus history of building projects, and we build projects not only onshore, but also offshore and deep water subsea. So, I mean, our challenge in this new and nascent industry, and as others have said, hydrogen is not a production technology challenge. Hydrogen is an economic challenge, and hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, is a scaling challenge. So we look at it from a practical perspective, is how can we help people like Shell, people like CenterPoint Energy, people like the Port of Houston, take an idea, develop the idea into a practical economic solution, and then build the solution safely and in a manner that the business objectives of the likes of CenterPoint and Shell and the Port of Houston are built. So our request to all of the operators is that we need to start with the end in mind. Our end goal is to replace or decarbonize existing forms of energy. How do we practically do that in a manner that it's timely? Because, you know, as Pierre-Etienne is saying, that we can't wait 5, 10 years to do this. But how do we do it in a manner that's timely, and how do we do it in a manner that's economically feasible? Some of that will need to come from policy support, but a lot of it will need to come from how we collaborate together. I've heard the word coordination by a couple of my friends who spoke earlier, but I'll take this a little further. I think what we need is not just cooperation, we need collaboration. We need to move to an engagement model which is not a rectangular or a square table, but a round table. We need to move to a contracting strategy that shares risk equitably across the stakeholders. Because without the ability to contractually deliver a project profitably for a contractor like ourselves, as well as the operators, you'll find that the project will take a long time. The other aspect, which we are, when we talk to our peer groups and we talk to our customers, is that we need to move away from the traditional oil and gas method of delivering projects to a much more speed to market strategy. A typical oil and gas project from conception into delivery can often take a good part of a decade. And I don't think we've got that sort of time in the energy transition sector. We have in the traditional oil and gas sector a very fragmented market in terms of standards, in terms of lack of standardization, and in terms of how we buy equipment. So, you know, I know the IOGP, the International Oil and Gas Producers Grouping, is doing a lot of work in that. But Andy, to really make this work, we've got to rethink how we deliver projects. And we've got to do that collaboratively. We've got forums in which we are starting to do that. But my request to everyone on the operator side, on the developer side, is let's work together to redraw how we do this. Now, why is Houston the ideal location to do this? Is because we've got a huge human talent pool. We don't talk about really is that the decades of experience we've got in Houston, in the Houston area, of delivering very complex projects. I mean, projects which are not too different from putting man on the moon. If you really get into some of the LNG projects we do, $5, $10 billion developments, some of the deep water subsea developments we do, that talent pool, if we focus that on energy transition, it can deliver wonders for us. But we've got to do it collaboratively. We've got to move away from a rather typical us versus them sort of.
Vaseem, I think we just lost your audio. Vaseem, I may come back to you. We heard you on the us versus them and calling out the need for different contract structures and even more fundamentally different approaches to projects. Both excellent points. So hold that thought. When you come back online, happy to have you finish. Pierre, I wanted to come to you because, again, you've seen a lot go on in hydrogen for many, many years, and would be interested in your view again and your current company's role in the chain. I think you might highlight that, but then also how you'd see pulling these chains off in the Houston area.
So thank you. Yeah, it's true that we are really changing scale in this dynamic. As some of you know, I used to be working and managing the hydrogen activities for Air Liquide, and I think from other colleagues will speak later in this conference. And we've been pioneering many small-scale projects over the last 10 years in the transport, in the green hydrogen or or carbon capture technologies. But now the key is indeed to go really massively at scale. And in fact, hydrogen is going to become really the disruptor of this new energy system if we believe in all the estimates that everybody is doing, because for having a clean energy world, you need electrons and a clean gas, and the clean gas is hydrogen without CO2. That's basically that. So if you take that for Houston, I think there are three urgent topics. First is to solve rapidly the question, are you long or short on hydrogen, which changes the way you look at it. And of course, I think Houston should be long and should be an export hub, which is changing completely the way you look at things. And then second, you need to look at which places are the easiest to move to. And of course, the first one is to shift existing consumers from gray to green or gray to blue by giving the right type of policy schemes like contract for difference, which enable the customers to afford the premium that is attached to a clean product. And which is it's a little bit the same as the 45Q system that you have today, but that needs to be used massively. Then the second topic is that you've got other customers which need not only to shift from gray to green, but need to shift from a fossil-based energy into a clean energy, which can be hydrogen. So that entails technology and process changes. So it's more the type of project which requires CapEx support to start, to demonstrate at scale, and then you can regulate. And that's basically what Europe is trying to do. And the third one, of course, is back to what we've been starting with Shell, with Total, and with many other companies, and with the OEMs, is to move into those heavy-duty transportation segments, which is a demand creation which is fundamental, but which requires a collaboration between us, the infrastructure players, the OEMs, and so on. And so then I will just conclude in your question with indeed what I am doing now, because this 5G hydrogen means nothing to people if you don't explain. I've been advocating over the last 2 years with Air Liquide and with the Hydrogen Council that we need scale, so we need share risks, and we need infrastructure funds to move into the game. And so I'm basically walking the talk by creating the first one that is aiming to become a 1 billion or 1.5 billion infrastructure fund dedicated to the hydrogen infrastructure assets, because we believe those assets, if they're produced at scale, will be the assets of the future, the infrastructure assets of the future. And that hydrogen will be the new asset class for large infrastructure funds. So we've got already some support from a couple of industry players well known in the industry. So Plug Power, of course, well known in the hydrogen one, Chart Industries and Baker Hughes. And we are, of course, discussing with many others to move forward. We think indeed that the financial community, next to the policymakers and the industry players that are around the table, are the three together capable to make this change. And this is what we're trying to bring to the table with 5G hydrogen.
And this is a public-private fund, or where are the dollars sourced?
The dollars will be sourced mostly from private industrials and private financial, long-term financial players, sovereign funds, institution pension funds, and players like that. And then we will aim to invest only between 20 to 100 million per project as minority partners with the large industrial players that want to go, just to help to enable share the risks, eventually bring deconsolidation schemes to the system, because it could be necessary, because the returns at the start will not be exactly the one that you're used to have, but it's needed to move forward.
Right. And this is in the context of anticipating contract for difference, maybe tweaks to 45Q or other.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the Californian regulations for OEMs and the move of green, clean solutions is an interesting one to be used in many other states. The PCFD is a very strong one that could be looked at. You've got also, of course, the 45Q, if it can be extended further. I think it's a good support scheme to make things fly economically. And then a fund can move on, because the fund, of course, is not there just to save the world. It's there to make profit as anyone. But I think it can help bring the dynamic to the world.
That's terrific. Well, good luck with that endeavor. That's terrific.
Thank you.
Vaseem, are you back with us, or you're making some nice cases for change that I think we're quite important to this. So if not, we can continue.
Yes, Andy, I'm back.
Are you?
My apologies. We got for some reason it dialed us out, so we had to dial back in again.
No problem.
Yeah. But I mean, I was basically done, Andy. So you know, if I were to wrap this up, I would say that hydrogen is a great place because the technology exists. It has adjacency, which means we don't have the transportation problem to solve immediately. It'll be a problem we need to solve. But if we can be adjacent, in other words, we can produce hydrogen in close proximity to where it's consumed, which is ideal for Houston, given the availability of renewable power, given the availability of gas. The only other ingredient we need is to be able to collaborate in a practical manner and in a manner that we take the best practices of our oil and gas industry, we take the genius of our people, but we don't use the fragmented approach we have to deliver projects today.
Yeah,
Andy, back to you.
Thank you. Are you seeing, just out of interest, the sorts of contract structures you were referring to and/or collaborative and different major project approaches being demonstrated in other parts of the world that we could learn from and lever off of here?
We definitely are. We are seeing a divergence. You see, hydrogen is both a utility and consumed by the oil and gas industry. So a lot of the non-oil and gas companies which are coming into the energy transition sector are coming in with a blank sheet. So they are much more amenable to alternate contracting strategies than the more traditional oil and gas companies who have procurement procedures, contracting procedures enshrined into their operating procedures, and they take time to change. But you know, it is changing. Even amongst the majors, it is changing. People are beginning to see that there needs to be a different way of delivering projects if we are to deliver a cost-effective solution in the time frame that the users, the consumers, the stakeholders, and the public are really demanding. I mean, there's a lot more pressure on energy transition in Europe, where I'm sitting today, than there is in the US. But I have no doubt that things are going to change rapidly in the US as well. So the answer, Andy, is yes, but not at a pace we'd like to see it.
Yeah, understand. Thank you. Great comments again. All right, so we're down to the lightning round here, and I'd like each of the panelists, and you may have hit this already, but just for emphasis, what's the single most important thing Houston should be doing to accelerate its move to the hydrogen economy? And maybe I'll just go around the way I see the squares on my screen, but that would be you, Scott, if you don't mind kicking off this round.
Yeah, so I think we're ready for hydrogen in pockets, and so we can get started. We just need it at a lower cost.
Great, thank you. Pierre, final thoughts?
I will bounce back on what Vaseem said with the engineering world saying need to change views. I think this hydrogen thing is an occasion to change views on the energy scheme and to look at it as a huge opportunity for speed, scale, and new source of profits and growth. So please change views on it and don't look at it as a burden or a cost, but an opportunity.
And hydrogen being a vanguard regarding the whole energy transition. Wonderful. Chris?
You know, before I give you my thoughts on the speed round, I think it was Vaseem who made mention to putting a man on the moon, and it just dawned on me, hydrogen was critical to space exploration in the 60s, and of course Houston was at the center of the space program, right? So it would only be fitting if now that hydrogen is seen as a key energy source for a lower carbon future, if Houston once again has the potential to lead. So I think that's a very nice parallel. And
it really
look,
is.
I'm excited by how far this city has come. I think it was mentioned yesterday that just a few years ago we couldn't say decarbonization, and today our challenge is how fast we move and what role will Houston play. And I think it was in Bobby Tudor's session or in day one, there was an audience poll that dealt with the timeline and the sense of urgency. And I think 3/4 of the respondents said action within 6 months. So I think that's where I also land. We need action. It falls on the various stakeholders across the value chain to collaborate, to kick off important work, and to build out this viable path to commercial success. Unless we demonstrate commercial success, we have work to do, and Houston is critical in that.
Excellent. And I love your hearkening back to the moonshot and the city that was instrumental to making it happen. And why not the Earth shot, huh?
That's right.
What better place? Thanks, Chris. Vaseem, any last comments from you? Most important priority?
I mean, I think Chris is absolutely correct. Hydrogen got us to the moon, right? So why not hydrogen? I think what I would ask the mayor of Houston, the champions of industry in Houston, is be an advocate for clean energy, for renewable energy, for energy transition at the state level and at the federal level. We need your help, ladies and gentlemen, to advocate alternate energies, hydrogen being one of them, at the state and the federal level. That's what will make it happen.
Yeah, very good, Vaseem. Well said. If you look at Rotterdam, again, there are multiple levels of government and policy and incentives in place that are enabling that significant transformation. So thanks again. Rich, over to you. Cleanup.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think one accelerator would be to energize the demand function. And if the trucks aren't consuming hydrogen and the vessels aren't consuming hydrogen in some way, then all the infrastructure in the world won't do us any good. And that's actually something that can start at a small level and then scale up pretty quickly. I think just a few years ago, there were only a few ships in the world that were LNG powered, and a lot of them have started to adopt dual fuel standards and so forth. So we're probably at a tipping point in terms of looking at how trucks can be driven with alternative fuels. I don't know who's going to win and lose between the different kinds of fuels, but I think it's more important to incentivize those truck owners to transition on to different power sources. And then that will catalyze at least a pilot hydrogen supply chain, and then I can grow from there.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks for punctuating again, Rich, the importance of stimulating the new market side and the priority on trucking. Great ending points. So, well, Brett, if you're still with us here, I don't know if we have a minute or two to take a question from the audience, but back over to you.
Well, Andy, I think we're running a little short on time, so let me just see if I can summarize and maybe put this back in the framework that we talked about. So we talked about future back, so let's think about what we heard in terms of the future. We're going to see significant growth in hydrogen. 100 million tons is what we heard of global demand. We heard about adjacencies, that this is going to emerge in clusters and hubs, and Houston is well positioned there. And that we really have the assets to grow this, whether it's a green or blue, that we can sort of be the Switzerland of hydrogen, that all of these value chains are going to happen in Houston. So that's maybe a little bit of what the future might look like. So the next question is, how did we get there? And we heard a lot about that. We heard about that we need to address the challenges in terms of being able to build demand, certainly with these new applications to begin with. We need to be able to drive costs down, and we need to build this at scale. But ultimately, that if we're successful at this, the world needs our hydrogen from Houston. We need to be a player in decarbonizing the world because the world can't do it without us. And so that's how we're going to get there, through those things like scale and driving the economics in these new demand centers. And then finally, what did we do to make that happen? Well, we heard about cross-cutting initiatives, things like connecting the dots. But even more than connecting the dots, we need to find new business models that are collaborative. We need to look at things like contracts for differences. And we need to be an advocate for new policy solutions. Those are the things that are going to make a difference. And finally, at the end of the day, it's all about the money. So these infrastructure funds, we need the capital to make this happen. So if you think about in terms of where we could be in terms of the future, how we got there, and what it's going to take to do it, I think our panel did a great job of summarizing that. But I think the biggest takeaway that I took away from this panel is the big idea. And if you think about what we talked about in terms of what Daniel said at the very beginning, what made Houston grow? It was a vision of what Houston could be, the idea of the ship channel, the idea of putting the man on the moon. And it's appropriate that perhaps we're going to talk later today about Earth shots, because not, as people have mentioned, not 10 minutes from here at Rice Stadium, over 60 years ago, President Kennedy gave the historic speech that we will go to the moon, and that we will do it from in 10 years from Houston. And the DOE has had a similar vision for what an Earth shot might look like. And it's perhaps appropriate that that Earth shot could happen with hydrogen in Houston, just as the moonshot happened. So I do think that is our big idea today, that our vision is for Houston to lead, just as we led in the race to space. So with that, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back shortly.
Bravo. Thank you. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much.